Welcome again to the Solid Signal podcast. This time around, it's October 25th, 2021, and I have a feeling this is going to be a long podcast, possibly the longest one yet, which means it's going to be over 10 minutes. You know, there's a tendency, a lot of people want to do a 30 to 45 minute podcast. I tend to not do that. I think 5 to 7 minutes is probably the right amount of time for the kind of information that I put out. And I tend to think that you really wouldn't listen too much if I consistently went over 10 minutes. I had a lot of thought about what I wanted to podcast about this week. And first, a little bit of a commercial. If you're going to be in the Fort Lauderdale area this week, starting on Thursday, the Fort Lauderdale International Boat Show will be in town. And you will find our friends at Signal Connect in the Marine Electronics tent at booth 606. Please go and visit them if you happen to be there. But I've talked about that in the past, and I know that your plans are already set in stone at this point. I thought it might be kind of fun to talk a little bit about Dune, the recent film which came out in theaters and also on HBO Max. Now, in the past, I have been promoting HBO Max content, as HBO is owned by AT&T, and for a long time, DirecTV was wholly owned by AT&T. They're still actually owned something like 70% by AT&T, and I thought the synergy would be kind of a good choice, and it still probably is, but I've backed off a little bit on pushing that quite so hard. I want to talk about this movie, give you my review of it, which is admittedly off topic for what we do at Solid Signal, but, you know, we'll get back to selling you antennas next week, I promise. The 2021 version of Dune is an adaptation of a book that first came out in 1965. 1965's Dune was not the first serious attempt at world building and mature content in science fiction, but it was one of the first. You can look back at Isaac Asimov's Foundation series and some of the works of Robert Heinlein, which really pushed the science fiction genre further. But you have to understand that in the 1960s and before, science fiction was largely looked at as a children's pursuit. And any attempt to push it into a more mature realm would come off today something like a Paw Patrol movie that actually addressed serious global issues, even more so because it hadn't been done at the time. I mean, really, in the 1960s, there were things that were looked at for young people and things that were looked at as more mature. And at the time that this was published in 1965, this was even before the Beatles had really pushed popular music into being more appreciated as a global art form. So you have to look at it that way. But having read the original Dune and many of its sequels, I never found it terribly enjoyable. I guess that's an admission that I need to make. I think partially that's because I was fairly young when I read Dune, and I was still enjoying some of that less mature science fiction that, you know, was very popular at the time. But as I go back and think about it, yes, there's a lot of stuff that makes, you know, that the philosophy really kind of helps. But it wasn't my favorite sci-fi at the time. It's still not my favorite sci-fi. And yet, I watched the 1984 movie, which, by the way, I do not recommend. I rewatched it over the weekend, and it is every bit as bad as I remember, and then some, because in addition to being bad for its time, it's just bad. But I don't want to get too far into that because this is really about the 2021 movie. I did watch the sci-fi miniseries in 2000 that's not available to stream now, and probably for the best. It was, I thought, a little bit better at the time in going into some of the detail that was there, but it wasn't very well presented. Overall, I think the 2021 version of Dune is the best yet, but it's still not good. First of all, you know, honestly, this is the best that Dune has ever looked, and that's not surprising with the 2021 budget and all that CG that's been available. I think the casting was relatively good, especially compared to the previous. I am not the biggest fan of Timothée Chalamet and probably never will be. But he was very well cast in this film, largely because he looks very young, and the character he plays needs to be very young, and yet he's old enough that I think he can mature with the role if they continue to make sequels. But what's missing from the 2021 version, and was equally missing from the previous, even more so, is the stuff that really made Dune work. Dune is not a terribly exciting story. I mean, you can look at it, yeah, okay, there's some battle and there's some, stuff going on, but in the end, I don't mean to spoil it for you. It's, largely a story of a boy who gets cast out and carries his mother around with him, and eventually the whole universe comes to realize that he's a super cool dude in the tradition of later characters like Neo and Luke Skywalker. But it's just not that great of a story unless you consider the politics behind it. While I didn't enjoy those politics when I was younger, I do recognize that there's a lot of great stuff that could be said. And I think that Dune, as a probably pair of movies that span about 5 hours, that's great. But you probably need between 12 and 15 hours to really get into some of the politics that make Dune interesting. For example, and this is kind of one of the things about Dune that I found a little bit more intriguing. By the 101st century, or whatever it is that they're in, people don't trust computers. You can look at Dune as possibly taking place in the same universe as the Matrix, because at one point the human race was enslaved by artificial intelligences. And since they broke free of that, they don't use artificial intelligence at all, and just limited amounts of computer power to help them do things like, fly their machines and stuff like that. But what's really kind of key in the whole Dune universe is the use of people in roles that here in the 21st century, we kind of think that computers would take on. Heavy computational tasks, for example, and the way that humans evolved into specialized beings so that they could take on these computational tasks. And it isn't really measured or explained to great detail in the 2021 Dune why this planet is so important. It's the only source of what they call spice, which there's other words for it in the original book, but they don't really explain that it's not just, some sort of hallucinogen or something like that, but it's also really what makes space travel possible. They may have said it. I'm not saying they didn't say it, but you can't really underestimate the value of this material, that without it, pretty much all of the known universe would be isolated from itself. And that's something that they don't talk about very much. It tends to make the whole thing seem less epic, because realistically, there's how much reason is there to fight for this planet, and why do people care? They don't really go into that. If they made this into a series kind of along the lines of Game of Thrones, I think they would have the time to explain that sort of thing. But it begs the question of whether or not people would really be up for that much exploration, because there's so much in the politics of Dune that you got to know about in order to really understand what's happening. I enjoyed this film. I will not say that it was boring, and I did, I got, I think, the ability to look at it on two levels. On one level, being familiar with the source material, I was able to say, okay, they've covered as many of the high points as they possibly could, but then, they had to make certain decisions in order to make it a little bit more dramatic in this case. But I think that what they, I was also able to look at it in the lens of somebody who hadn't really been deeply, deeply immersed in the source material, didn't consider it sacred, and was just able to look at it from its own point of view. From that point of view, it's a fairly grim and self-important kind of movie. And And yet, for all of its self-importance, you find it difficult to understand why it is important. And I don't get that. I guess it doesn't. It doesn't make sense to me that the filmmakers wouldn't explain why all of these things are of such critical importance. It's just more another case where what we've seen with the Star Wars prequels or with Game of Thrones or whatever, there's a political structure and the political structure is complex and it's highly corrupt and you're just supposed to take that at face value. Okay. Obviously, that doesn't make for terribly interesting filmmaking. So before I cut off, because I do see I am starting to run kind of long, I want to talk a little bit about the casting. Casting's an interesting thing because when you do cast a movie, what you're doing is you're setting in stone a lot of your choices that may not necessarily age super well. I think that if you look at the 1984 Dune, most of that casting doesn't age well at all. And you look at this combination of characters as being this kind of hacky group of 1980s people who just kind of showed up in stuff and mostly in, crime television shows. And it just wasn't that exciting to look at them and think of them as these characters. But yet I do think that for the most part, a lot of the casting is good. I'm not 100% sure I'm really on board with Zendaya as Chani, and yet she doesn't have a really big role in the first one. So I'm gonna reserve judgment because she'll probably have a really big role in the second one if that follows the book. I said Timothée Chalamet, who I'm not a huge fan of, did a great job, and Oscar Isaac is great in everything that he does. Everybody else, it's hard to know if those characters are really going to be well served by those actors. I'm not convinced by it. You got to at least hope that they probably just stay, for the most of them, more of a supporting character. They don't do something in the future that makes their time on Dune look embarrassing. I don't know. I'm kind of curious to see if anybody else really had an opinion on this film, but my final review is that it's not really one for the ages. I'll watch the second one if they make it, but it was just more a temporary distraction, not something that's going to change my life moving forward. In the meantime, please do like and subscribe, enjoy, and I will be back next week with a more on-topic video. I'm sure that you will enjoy it. Have a great week, and thanks so much for listening.